We saw the Nagant revolver as a secondary arm in the Belgian army. But in that same Great War, a more modern version was still the official handgun of Russia. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is a Russian revolver Systema Nagant model 1895. This is a very well-known little handgun, but let's go ahead and get over to the light box so you can get an extra close look. With an overall length of 9 3/4 inches and weighing in at 1.7 pounds, this is a much handier revolver than that old 1878. While it is still a gate loader, it now seats 7 cartridges, these being the 7.62 Nagant cartridge. Most notably, this is a gas seal system. More on that in a moment. Now, this has been a highly requested episode, and I know that you are all eager to get started, but as is tradition, we must first start with a review of what we know so far. Émile and Léon Nagant started their own metalworking business in 1859, and in 1867, they entered arms making by licensing the Remington rolling block rifle. This was nice for a time, but in experimenting with the system, they hit on a neat double-barrel pistol of their own make. This used a 9.4mm cartridge that had been adapted from the earlier Dutch 1873 revolver, and in that same year of 1877, Émile Nagant would work up his own revolver patent. The first I don't have a lot of detail on, but the second, well, that had some promise. It would be submitted to Belgian army trials and improved throughout testing. This resulted in the Belgian Model 1878, a finely finished and moderately complicated design, but the price was a bit high and the Belgians wanted something a little cheaper and safer to hand to, well, non-officers. So Émile Nagant whipped up a single action only 1883 with an extremely simple lockwork. This design was a great success, but obviously the greater market would prefer to have a double and single action option, and so that functionality was added back, but with fewer parts than the original 78, which resulted in the 78-86, which was also purchased by Belgium for officer use. While Belgium adopted the simplified gun in 1886, the action was available a few years before and actually started selling internationally, so we'll see sales to places like Luxembourg and Brazil and a tiny handful of Norway. It was a success, but not necessarily a game changer. It did, however, give Nagant, the company, a little bit of clout in the military industry. So throughout all this, Émile Nagant had been the primary designer, but about the time of the 86, he was starting to go blind, and so his younger brother Léon was taking on a bigger role in the actual invention work, and this means Léon was most likely the man who made all the changes that we'll see in our gun today. The first big decision would be to go with a small bore cartridge. Now, don't get me wrong, 9.4mm was actually for that time already fairly small, but experiments in Switzerland, led by Edard Rubin, were revealing that a high-speed, small diameter round was just as good, if not better, than a slow, fat bullet. And there were a lot of advantages to carrying less mass around on your person all the time. That extra speed came pretty easy because in 1882, Rubin had worked up jacketed bullets. These were capable of moving pretty dang quick without breaking up like a regular lead ball would. Additionally, in 1886, the French had adopted smokeless powder and had revealed it to the world in 1887. This, as we have covered, resulted in the Lebel 1886 rifle, an evolution that suddenly got even the most sluggish arms commissions to rush into action adopting a new rifle. While we can pore over the technological jump that smokeless powder represented, in revolvers, it really didn't make a huge difference, aside from clearing the air and allowing for more compact cartridges. And that's where Léon Nagant took his revolver, smaller calibers. He started with 8mm, then 7.65, and that particular cartridge actually rolled into a design for prison guards. Actually, this is about where we get a police and prison guard Nagant designed to use a sequential load of cartridges, starting with a blank, then a gas cartridge, then normal ammunition. The same concept can be seen on an earlier Belgian style revolver, also probably designed by the Nagants, in a video that is available from Forgotten Weapons, so check that out when you get the time. The improved design, minus the cylinder lock, would be submitted to Swedish trials. During this process, the cartridge would be further stepped down to just 7.5 millimeters in diameter. This resulted in the Swedish Model 1887, a compact, lighter, and still just as effective Nagant revolver. Now, I don't actually have one of those today, but what I do have is actually a Norwegian contract Nagant. These are nearly identical to the Swedish, and we can use it to take a closer look at where the invention was at this point in the process. So, zooming on in. Hey, this should look really familiar because it's dang near identical to our previous 7886 from last episode, but there are a number of minor changes. Number one, it is much smaller. I have already disassembled the other 86, but just ignore the disassembly for a moment and just look at the scale. I mean, we are down 10, maybe 15% in size overall. It's fantastic. Now, the gun has a, let me get my patented plastic and pokey, has a sort of shark fin style front sight that's designed to have less reflection off the backside, let you very clearly pick up the very tip of the sight for alignment. Excellent. It has a different ejector rod just by a smidge. So in the previous one, we would just yank it out. In this particular design, we actually have to twist it over and then yank it out. So it's just a little extra security. Now, as far as disassembly goes, we rotate this guy over and pull out that central access pin just like before. We open the gate and the cylinder comes out. That part should be very familiar, and so should this next bit because it's identical. Again, still letter A, even though we're in Norway. And we'll just go ahead and unscrew this guy. This was Belgian made, by the way. Get this guy out. Ooh, don't slip and scratch. It's always so fun doing these things with the monitor instead of directly with my eyes. There we go. And once more, tap, 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 until we get what we're looking for. 1 second. There we go. Nice and easy, no sweating it, no unnecessary prying. You guys that have Smith & Wessons and Colts, really just tap. So we're inside the action. Let me get her spun around for you. This should seem 100% familiar if you saw our last episode, right? We have our trigger, our mainspring, our hammer, and we have a hammer nose with a V-spring in there, and that's about it. It is an extremely simple and durable design. And if we look at the earlier 86, it's exactly the same system. The only big mechanical change in the entire thing is, again, having to twist the ejector rod before being able to pull it out of the action. Otherwise, it's just much smaller, much more comfortable in the hand, and that's it. This is the new, smaller, smokeless-ready Nagant. Neat. Now, guns very similar to this one would be adopted in several countries. Sweden and Norway, obviously. Argentina, Greece, and Serbia, actually. Although the Serbian 1891 is fairly unique, as it did apparently include an Abadi gate safety. That's the system where when the gates open, you can pull that trigger and it's disconnected from the hammer. It'll just index the cylinder over. We've seen that in some other systems that we've done for the show. They would actually remain in service through the Great War, so there's another one for our list, all right? Nagant, 1891, also in Serbia during the war. All right, so we have our handier, lighter Nagant revolver, but where does Russia come in? Well, they had just adopted their first smokeless rifle, one that had significant input from the Nagant firm. In the same year, the Russian Artillery Commission would issue a directive to start searching for a new smokeless revolver. At this time, Russia was still very much influenced by the French military. The Mosin barrel and sights had actually been taken straight from the Lebel, and well, there's an interesting trick to that barrel. The French revolver 1892, which was actually the end result of a number of transitional designs, had been built to use the same bore diameter in rifle as the standard infantry long arm. You see, barrel production was one of the most expensive and time-consuming bits of gun manufacture. It's not as simple as just sort of screwing things together, is it? Getting them just right was a pain, and often flaws were limited to just an inch or so. So with a 3-foot barrel, that's a problem, but instead of just scrapping it entirely and all that money down the drain, you could cut into smaller segments, mill out the outer surface, and bingo, new revolver barrels on the cheap. Excellent way to reduce waste and combine manufacturing tooling. Since the Russians had adopted the 7.62 or 3-line cartridge, they would need a 3-line revolver cartridge. At first, they would fish around internally. Even SMG Book submitted his own design, a modification of the then current Smith & Wesson No. 3. We've covered this gun before, but for review, it was a single action only top break in an 11mm black powder cartridge. This was the Russian standard issue as we're talking about all this. While a fantastic gun, the Russians actually weren't entirely happy with it any longer. Constantly facing financial struggles, they were not enthused by the simultaneous ejection system, that top break, pop, and scatter. The ability to rapidly reload these guns meant that the officers and cavalry kept shooting more ammo, and ammo costs money. The system simply must be slower. To heck with whether it's efficient and people are, living or dying or not, I guess. I'm not kidding, by the way. There was also likely concerns about the strength of another open top system. As much as I love the No. 3, that latch isn't as strong as it could be and will suffer from wear and parts breakage sooner than a good solid strap all the way around, especially in the smokeless era. Now, in the time that the No. 3 had been adopted, double-action revolvers had really caught on, with most powers going for a combination single and double, or a triple action as it were. Again, this sounded like a waste to Russia. Double action also hurt accuracy, and since it was going to take a while to load your gun anyway, why be in a hurry about shooting it? Russia's going to stay with single action only. They were also terribly frightened of horses. Okay, well, I guess this is probably more to do with cavalry, but they wanted a cartridge that could penetrate a horse's skull at 50 Schritt. That's a Russian pace. They translated that to meaning piercing four 5-inch thick boards. Now, initially they wanted a cartridge identical to French 8mm ordnance, just with a 7.65 diameter bullet, but probably because of trying to eke out every little bit of power they could from that small diameter, they dropped that requirement in the face of something that we'll see a little bit later. Sergei's concept was too complicated and nothing else looked all that promising in the home market, so they had to branch out and take on submissions from abroad. Given the sheer size of Russia, any contract looked to be pretty lucrative, so submissions poured in from just about every martial handgun producer. 2 men, however, stood above the rest, mostly because both of them had brought along a unique solution to that problem of squeezing out more power of the 3-line handgun cartridge. The first was Belgian arms maker Henri Piper, who we've mentioned before, and I'm happy to say we will see again in much more detail in a future episode. Piper was, at the time, experimenting with a technology that actually had been attempted for a number of decades through various patents that I've managed to find. He was working on a gas seal revolver. So, you know what, let me take a look. I want to show you something about this. When you deal with a revolver, you have an inherent gas leak that is part of the design, because at some level, this cylinder has to rotate behind the barrel. And the gap that's created between the cylinder and the barrel, because they can't just drag together, you would just be grinding metal, that gap, well, that allows excess gas to escape. Not even excess, I mean, it's just directly the gas. The pressure that is driving the bullet is reduced because there is a leak 360 degrees around, and for a length that is sort of determined by how close and tight of a fit you want. So that is going to always be an issue with a revolver unless you find a way to somehow mechanically seal that surface at the moment of firing and then release it so that the cylinder is then free to rotate. That is the problem that we will see 2 Belgians try to solve, the first of which being Henri. Now, I should say there are a number of patents around this idea, so Henri's not the first person ever, it's just that he would be the one to take up the cause that would then be handed over to the Russians. He had been working on it since 1889 and went through a number of methods. While he showed several to Russia, I'll limit this to his most successful design just for the sake of time. In this system, the cylinder indexes forward as you cock the hammer or the trigger in double action. The cylinder itself seals against a forcing cone at the rear of the barrel. Pretty much similar to the gun that we'll see in a moment, but this cams from an extension on the trigger at the base of the cylinder and is a hinged reinforcement that closes at the top as the hammer drops, hinging from the top. This system, along with a swing-out cylinder and simultaneous eject with a 7-round capacity, was adopted in Mexico. It was, at that time, very advanced. So, of course, the Russians hated it. They had loved the gas seal saving them a few dozen feet per second, but they had no interest in a swing-out cylinder or double-action system. It seems, from the notes I have found, that they kept shipping back Piper guns for being too complicated, and he just kept handing them other just as advanced designs with all sorts of bells and whistles. I can't find any mention of him even submitting a definite gate loader with no exceptions or a single action. He might not have realized just how committed they were to simplicity. Meanwhile, Léon Nagant was also working with gas seal systems, although only since 1892 as far as we can tell, after the Russians had already started poking around. It is very likely in true Liège tradition that he borrowed whatever couldn't be bolted down by a patent. The Nagant system also indexed the cylinder forward, however it used a simpler system based off just the hand shoving the cylinder forward. The system relied on the cartridge case mouth to seal around the forcing cone, and there are signs that Piper had tried this method as well, but I'm unsure who got there first. That means that the Nagant cartridge was of course 7.62 in diameter, but that the bullet was recessed down into the case so that the case mouth could be pressed against the cone at the rear of the barrel, achieving a gas seal just before firing. This smaller cartridge also allowed him to add a 7th round like Piper. Now, Nagant had worked with the Russians before, not just on the 1891 3-line rifle, but he had also produced the Galland revolver for them previously. That would be one of these, although sadly, this guy is not actually Russian, or this would be a totally different show right now. Anyway, Léon knew how to deal with the commission. He took his simple gate-loading revolver, one already in service elsewhere in the world, a proven design, and he added the gas seal and the new cartridge, and then he actually just ripped out the double action features, effectively breaking the gun into being single action only. He sent it on its way still in 1892, and the Russians loved it, so much so that they basically asked, how much? What are we going for on this? He wanted, unfortunately, 75,000 rubles, but for that amount, he was giving up the whole license for production. That, to the Russians, was too many rubles, so they said nope, and immediately restarted the entire trials process. You can't win if you don't swing, so good on Nagant for trying. In November of 1892, the commission actually set down a list of necessary features, and they invited new players from all around the world. The first few were the same that we saw before. 7.62 diameter bullet, same rifling as Mosin, single action, singular load and eject, stop a horse at 50 Schritt. The rest would include a weight of no more than 2 pounds, the cylinder and barrel must withstand 1,500 atmospheres of pressure, it must be able to use black or smokeless powder, it must be easily handled, it must be simple to disassemble for cleaning, it can't have any complicating machining operations that would make it really hard to produce. There were some durability specifications, the sights must be zeroed for 25 meters, and some specifications for accuracy at certain ranges. The best cartridge submitted would get a prize of 5,000 rubles, and the best revolver would receive 20,000 rubles. Of course, by accepting that prize, you granted the Russian government full rights to manufacture your design, and they learned that little trick from the whole Mosin Nagant debacle that we've covered in a previous episode. They included a right to manufacture abroad. these requirements were pretty narrow, so the submissions were a bit limited, and we ended up right back where we started from, Nagant versus Piper. I've already told you Piper just didn't get it. He kept submitting designs and they kept being rejected. His last little feature actually did ditch the swing out cylinder and simultaneous ejection in favor of a gate loader, which I did say he didn't do that before, but he went a step beyond because he made it automatically eject the previously fired cartridges, and while that is cool, the Russians don't want anything fancy. So Piper really just ran himself out of the competition by being too good at his job. Basically, it came down to a reassessment of the Nagant all over again. I mean, yeah, there were a few others out there, but Russia's going through the motions. They know they're about to deal with Nagant again. Léon, however, had updated his design slightly in 1894. He fitted larger sights, tapered the rear of the chambers to ease loading just a bit. He shortened the grip some and shortened the clearing rod. He also fluted the cylinder a bit more to reduce weight even further down. All nice improvements that did not offend Russian sensibilities. Starting in March of 1894, the Nagant was pitted against the current Smith & Wesson No. 3, and it performed quite well. It was lighter, more accurate, and it had better penetration. Plus, in general, it was favored as being potentially more rugged. The artillery officers apparently received either a poorly finished gun or bad ammunition. They were unimpressed and required further investigation. Kind of a bad luck situation, but this happens. The cavalry were very pleased, but wondered why it did not have a double action pull. They wanted automatic ejection as well, so it seems maybe Piper had impressed somebody because they were basically calling for the Piper. That means that despite all this work, the Commission's last real pick wasn't going over so well internally. Yeah, it beat the old gun, but people wanted more. They mulled it over, and by the end of 1894, the double action was actually back on the table. So Léon sent over one of his guns with all the parts still inside, and this did the trick. The officers and cavalry were much happier, and now the Commission was not, because they still feared that the number one cause of injury so far had been shooting yourself in the leg with your handgun on the draw. I'm going to be honest, this may have been part of why the trigger spur was added to that No. 3 all those years ago, so that you had something to yank on other than a trigger to draw it out. I'm going to say the trigger pull on the 1895 is so severely heavy, I have no idea why they were worried about this. The gun's unloaded, guys, don't freak out, but I mean, I'm not gonna accidentally set this thing off. It's so rock hard heavy. Anyway, they opted to adopt two separate versions of the gun as a way of resolving this. An officer's with a double and single action or triple action, and an NCO/artillery/everybody else, that would be single action only. There would be a flurry of minor changes, but by the spring of 1895, everything was in order, and in May, a royal decree signed by Emperor Nicholas II adopted this gun right here, the Nagant 1895. So this is the moment that you guys have all been waiting for. We can finally look at your gas seal revolver. All right, from the outside, not a lot of difference between these two guys. This is the earlier Norwegian, well, the year before Norwegian, but also like the Swede. The big difference, let me get these turned around so you can see it, is externally, just quickly, this Russian grip is a little shorter. You can see they noticeably shortened that up. But otherwise, not a huge departure between these two guns. So the big difference, though, is in how the gun works. In this case, if you watch the cylinder closely, I'm going to pull the trigger back, and look what happened. See that? Let me do it again. Oh, she came back. Now she went forward. It's the gas seal. There it goes, forward, right before impact. If I cock the hammer manually, forward. So what that's doing is it's indexing this cylinder up against a forcing cone that's at the rear of the barrel. And the reason that works, this is not original ammunition, this is just some Fiocchi, so it's slightly different taper, but you can see our bullet is way down in there. I know it's very small. And so this lip would get shoved inside that forcing cones so that the moment of firing, the whole system is gas sealed at the rear. There is no gas coming out the back here. We are keeping 100% of our gas pressure on the bullet moving down the bore. That's gonna make it accelerate even faster. We're gonna get higher muzzle velocity. So let me get that live ammo out of the way. Let's look at that one more time. It's gonna just right there forward, And that's the beauty of the entire system. That's the entire improvement over the previous one. Internally, it's just the same except for the parts that do that, but let's take a look anyway. So if I, again, rotate over and pull out, I can flip this guy over. Interesting thing, by the way, this gun is there's no provision for helping you to load, so you can't pull the trigger or anything. It's just gonna keep moving, it's gonna be a mess. You have to manually index, manually insert your 7 rounds. When you're done, you must manually eject each round one by one, but they do have a slight improvement here in that when this is swung all the way over for the ejector rod, it now still traps the central axis key. You have to actually walk it back just a smidge, and then the central axis key is free so that you don't accidentally lose this while loading or unloading the pistol. So that's pretty cool. That'll free our cylinder like we've seen so many times before. And then we're back to our screw on this side, which for once no longer has the letter A, but it's still the same operation. Your favorite part of the entire Nagant series, watching me undo this one screw over and over again. You know, this would actually be a good place for one of those captive screws with sort of the thumb head like we've seen on other designs. Maybe move it over a little bit, and then you wouldn't have to worry about losing that little screw in the field, but what do I know? So let me get this guy open, set that aside, and we're back in. And this looks, at a glance, identical. I know it's kind of glare, there we go. Looks identical to the earlier 7886 system, except if you're really eagle-eyed, you will see that there is a little bit of a transfer bar back under in here, and even I can't see it from here because I'm working from the monitor. But the idea is there's a component, like there's an extension on the trigger behind this little guy, this little notch that fits up on the nose and fits up on the bottom of the hammer. Behind that notch is a slight extension that is pushing up and down on just a linear rod, all right? So if you look very carefully, and if you can't, I forgive you because we will have the animation. When she comes back, that gets shoved upwards. And you might see it down in there. When that's shoved upwards, watch this guy here. This is the key. Ooh, let me get where you can see it. See that guy right there? I'll pull that trigger again. Let me get this gate out of my way, actually. And again, these like to self-disassemble while I'm doing them open, but see how he's retracted? And then again, I'm gonna cock. Now I would forgive you if you thought that that piston that's sticking out of there was actually what indexes the cylinder forward, but it's not. All that's doing is taking the base plate of the gun and moving it forward so that the moment of fire, the rear of the case is still supported. So that's just for this case to sit up against, and no, I'm not putting in the frame, this is a live case. The actual indexing is coming from a part that you wouldn't be able to spot as a difference between this and the previous Norwegian or Swedish designs. It's just the hand. It's literally just, let me get the angle in here, just that hand in there. That little guy, he's what's pushing forward on it. It's the change in the angle of the hand. You can see it's sort of raked forward back in here. And then it pushes up against this. And that's also part of why the trigger is so friggin' heavy, is because you are not getting a very direct camming action. You're applying a lot of pressure at a very oblique angle to push this forward. And then there's actually a spring that drives this back to the rear. So you're resisting that spring. You'll see more of that in the animation. So that's the secret, is just the hand shoving this forward, a spring in here to set it back, and an extra piece up here that cams out, and this is on a swinging link, and it's being driven by a linear cam. We'll see it in a moment. That's just to support the base of the cartridge, because you have to do both. You have to move the cartridge base forward and move the cylinder forward. That's the whole secret of the Nagant, and that's why there's so much trigger pull, because you're doing all those extra operations on top of what you would do for this, which makes this 1895 style very heavy and sort of lopey by comparison to the very smooth and moderate trigger of, say, a Norwegian or Swedish Nagant. Pretty cool. All right, so I get it. I said a lot of stuff in there is hard to see, and you guys are probably squinting pretty hard. So instead of fighting it and zooming in the camera and all that crazy stuff, let's just go ahead and use our X-ray vision and check in on an animation from Bruno so you can see exactly what the heck I'm talking about. We're still loading through a gate, 1 round at a time, now 7 in total. The operation will be the same as last episode, but with some new parts added. The first is the change to the hand, which now presses the cylinder forward and does not slip off at the top. When cammed forward, the case mouth of the cartridge engages the cone at the rear of the barrel. This is how we get our gas seal. Looking to the rear, we'll see a vertically sliding bar. This is controlled by a further extension of the trigger. As it rises, the bar presses on a pivoting block. This extends into the newly opened gap, supporting the rear of the case while locked in place, not unlike the bolt in a Winchester lever gun. A small tab at the bottom of this block tips it back when the trigger is released and the vertical slider drops. Unloading is the same slow manual process. Alright, let's get this over to Mae.
Проходил полгусару ночей, а там поднялся на ветку лишь пара голубеньких глаз. Смотрела несую гусары, что тут будет немного дурака. Пол проведен под бортом. Полночь, все спит мертвым сном, и не снится тебе. Командиром, что творится у них под окном, а на утро оружием сверкая, при звуках летит трубачей, по улице пыли подымая, уходил полгусару тащил, а там поднялся наверху лишь пара голубеньких глаз. Искала среди угодинки виновника милый прокат. И часто при свете лампады во мраке осенних ночей.
A lot of you might have handled these and you know that they're very stiff. I'm going to say that we had the benefit of this being an original Russian model made in 1904. We managed to get all 7 rounds out. Now, Léon Nagant got his prize money both for the cartridge and for the revolver. He also got a contract, 20,000 revolvers for 29 rubles apiece. This did include, however, 100 rounds per gun. Now, I'm actually uncertain of whether those guns were single or double action. I've seen sources say either way. My preferred source says that they were double actions with instructions on which pieces to remove in order to get a single action gun, but that doesn't make a lot of sense because I've seen at least one Belgian marked single action only hammer, and the hammers were different in those. As a matter of fact, let's take a quick look. You see, a real Russian single action is kind of rare these days. They were mostly converted later on to the single or double action. Single actions had their own hammer with no provision for a nose or V-spring. It's very distinct. So I'm betting at least some, if not all, of the original 20,000 started life as single actions. They were produced over a period of 3 years, and from my sampling, most were made in 1898. That's probably the last year of real production. They were really spun up and started to crank them out by then. On acceptance, they were stamped with the Tsar's Imperial Eagle. There would also be an early change to the design. That would be the front sight. Initially, the guns had, as you saw in this one, a triangular shark fin looking thing. And as I said, this was done to reduce glare, make it easier to use. It quickly gave way to a rounded pattern, likely to prevent snagging on the draw, Later on, we'll see the original site return sometime around or after World War II. Before we get too much deeper, I do need to cover a change up at the Nagant factory. While no longer deeply involved in the development of firearms, Émile Nagant was still firmly committed to arms invention and sales. His nephews, Léon's sons Charles and Maurice, however, had joined the company and were much more interested in automobiles and engine manufacture. Émile was having none of it and left the family business in 1896. So we go from the old company, which was still the parent company to the revolver business, to Fabrique d'Armes Léon Nagant, and shortly later that we shorten up to L. Nagant and Company. Okay, back to these revolvers. As part of the contract for the guns, Léon Nagant agreed to help set up the Tula arsenal in Russia for their own domestic production. Russian rearmament, however, came at a time of economic depression, and the Tsarist government struggled to make ends meet. Tula began some production in 1898, but it was a trickle until at least 1900, when full operations finally began. The same year, the St. Petersburg cartridge plant got to making 7.62 Nagant. From there, it's a bit of a roller coaster in terms of production. It was supposed to be like 60,000 a year, and in 1900 they hit that number, but budget slashing reduced it each year until by 1904, the date of this gun here, they were down to just 4,000 units that year. Still, despite partial rearmament, the Nagant did see some service fairly early on. The first known use in combat was documented during the Boxer Rebellion in June of 1900, when Lieutenant Stankovic of the 12th Siberian Regiment was the first to charge a Chinese fortified building. As he burst into the first occupied room, he encountered two charging Chinese fighters and apparently dispatched both with his Nagant 1895. I'm sure he was glad that that little 7.62 cartridge was actually effective. Now, production for the 1904 was a trickle, like I said, but that was followed by the Russo-Japanese War. This conflict would prove to embarrass Russia, as they were trounced at sea and didn't fare so well on land either. This was a major military victory for an Asian power instead of a European one. While the war meant a brief spike of a record 63,000 Nagants produced, it was immediately followed by production plummeting back down to 5,000 for the next year, as Russia was almost bankrupted by the war. Honestly, they would have made none, but there was this fear of releasing too much of the arsenal staff and losing that valuable skill in case of another war conflict. As time went on, Russia recovered slowly, and during this period they actually did trial a number of early auto-loading handguns. Ultimately, however, they were too expensive and complicated to even consider, but the matter was dismissed with a somewhat biased test instead. The War Minister had the men shoot a number of guns at a moving target 40 meters distance. That target was given a man's running pace. I'm unsure how far this virtual man was allowed to flee. The soldiers could shoot as much as they like, but that of course forced a reload, and only one gun of the dozen or so automatics tested actually managed to pull off a full mag change. That was only in 30% of cases, and it still only got them 2 extra rounds. That was the Luger 1900. It and eventually the FN 1903 would be approved for private purchase but not adopted. There would also be some limited purchases of FN 1900s and C96s later on. Again, you gotta pay for it. Production was still slow for the Nagant, and the arsenal was starting to stall out, so officials allowed them to produce for more divisions like police, and also to manufacture for private sales internally. By the way, Tula made guns that were costing the government about 22.31 rubles, so a fair bit cheaper than that original Belgian contract. The extra orders helped bulk up the numbers until 1910 and kept the arsenal afloat. That's when the political situation, particularly in the Balkans, was starting to warm up, so Russia wisely put some more cash into their rearmament program. During the Balkan Wars, Russia really started to amp production, and by July of 1914, they were feeling pretty good. They'd kind of caught up. They had 424,000 or so revolvers of both types, with projected wartime need of 436,000 and some change. Not perfect, but the number 3 could be used in a pinch, and Tula could be spun up to meet the gap if anything should happen. I mean, how long can a war last? So just like 11,000 short. That's like maybe 2 months production, and really only necessary if we mobilize the entire, Russian army. That's not going to be a big issue. We're not going to sweat it, right? War were declared. Yeah, that's going to be a problem. Pre-war total, 424,000. 1914, we managed to crank through 76,000. 1915, we're up in the 130,000s, that's good. But from there it gets a bit hazy. We only know that the final total for the war was roughly 474,800. That's more than what was assembled from 1898 until 1914 though. The working day at the factory, in order to keep up for this, was increased to 12 hours, and the employees received just 3 days off a month. Tula also widened what was acceptable by inspectors, although in true Russian fashion they were never really that loose to begin with. It was still fairly strict. Now, savvy viewers may note the Russia that started the war was not the one that finished it. The Russian Revolution had created mass confusion, but Tula remained hard at work even with the new communist government. As a matter of fact, in 1919, some 79,000 Nagant were produced. This number was halved, however, in 1920, but only because of extreme shortages of materials and general internal collapse. The entire time Tula was still apparently producing both single and double action versions of the Nagant. That was only stopped sometime in December of 1924, and apparently after that, I'm not sure when, most of the single actions appear to have been converted to double or single operation. Production of this triple action continued through World War II. Service in the Soviet Union continued beyond for a number of decades before most were refurbished and packaged away for the Cold War. Many of these have hit the collector's market in recent years at inexpensive prices, but those heavy coatings and the slapdash rebuilding process makes them extremely stiff to use, much worse than the one I have here. Don't get me wrong, an 1895 has a beast of a trigger, but this original one is a lot smoother. By the way, the reason that trigger is so bad, like we said, extra pressure for the gas seal. You're fighting the mainspring and the return spring for the cylinder. You're also meeting that hand at a weird angle, and we're swinging down that reinforcer for the back of the cartridge. And that begs the question, was the gas seal really worth all that when it really ruins the trigger? Well, let's look at some data. The French 1892, with a barrel length of 117 millimeters and that 8 millimeter cartridge, had a speed of 228 meters per second. The Austrian Rostengosser 1898, with a barrel length of 160 millimeters, again an 8 millimeter cartridge, although slightly different, had 230 meters per second muzzle velocity. The Nagant 1892, as tested, had a 115 millimeter barrel 7.62 cartridge that we know, and a 290 meter per second muzzle velocity. The French 1892 ordnance and the Austro-Hungarian Rostengosser of 1898 both represented fairly comparable small-bore smokeless revolvers with similar powder and barrel lengths and things like that. And here, this data tells us that we're getting about a 26% gain. So in theory, you can get a 7.65 millimeter cartridge to hit with about 1/4 more power. That's nothing to sneeze at, but this involves a dramatic increase in trigger weight. I'm not sure if I'm enthused by this concept. I get it, I just don't get it. Mind you, single action, it barely changes anything though, and that's what they were focused on when they started. So what about service life? Well, with war, the Nagant was expanded from just officers, artillery, and cavalry to other special troops like transport, machine gun teams, and grenadiers. But were these guns liked? Were they preferred? We do have some very early Tsarist opinions on record. 2 anonymous cavalry officers had some notes logged just after adoption. They were very similar. They both ignored the trigger issues and focused on the slow reloading. The complaint was that with an anxious horse and cold hands, they were not going to be able to reload the gun practically at all. The process was difficult enough when standing still. In their opinion, there was simply no way to recharge this gun while still in combat, and one stated plainly that he still preferred the Smith & Wesson. Period Brass didn't take the matter to heart, however. They argued that there was not really any investment in rapid loading on the battlefield for a handgun. Instead, if they're going to do that, they're going to put it into the rifle or the carbine. Just use your pistol once and then get out of there. Once the USSR was established, well, criticizing equipment was kind of a no-no. Still, we know of one account of a former World War II pilot who spoke up after the fall of the Soviet Union. I actually have a quote on this one. In many articles and books, it was a point of honor that the Nagant was particularly appreciated by its users. To my knowledge, it is not, and for my part, I formally reject this affirmation. The M95 was unanimously disliked by the troops because it was totally lacking in power and very slow to reload. Now mind you, that was an opinion from the era of reliable automatics. We'll get Mae's opinion on this in just a moment, but first let's check in on the Nagants. Léon Nagant would pass away in 1900 and Emile in 1902, although he had already left the business. Charles and Maurice would change the name of the company again following their father's death, obviously with a greater focus on cars. As a matter of fact, the only new Nagant firearm design after the 1895 would be the lackluster model 1910. I don't have one handy, but it was identical to this guy, but with a right-hand swing-out cylinder. Really just like the French 1892, you crank back that guy, pop her out, you're out. It's even suggested this was actually developed by another Belgian gunsmith, William Gras. It did not sell well. The Nagant firm was shuttered in 1914 during the German invasion, but would reopen post-war, even more focused on cars and with almost no arms production. In 1930, the firm as a whole would fold following financial failure. They didn't win in the car game. Interestingly, the machinery for the Nagant revolver line would be bought by Poland, and this resulted in their own Model 30 Nagant revolver, the last of the true line. And I say true line because there would be a fair few copycats, especially in Belgium and Spain, usually chambered in that 7.62 Russian round, although often lacking the gas seal. There's a whole line of those guys. They're not this, and I can't prove that they were in the war, but it's a curiosity. And that, dear viewers, is the whole story as I know it. Yes, there are some details from World War II we glossed over, but those are best served for another day, as this is still a World War I show for now. So let's go ahead and get Mae in here and hear what she has to say about this actually fairly odd handgun. It's kind of funny. There's so many of these out there that people think of it as normal, but it's weird. It's like the only widely adopted gas seal revolver that I know. I mean, yeah, Mexico had some, but that's about it. This is pretty unique. It's just there's a lot of them. So let's see how she feels about it. All right, gang, we have the bird with the word, and interestingly, we have two Rudy Tooty point and shooties because we only shot one. But this one here, this other guy in my left hand, your right, that is the Norwegian Nagant. It is the exact same mechanism internally without the gas seal. And the reason I want to have it here is to get sort of a separate opinion on shrinking the 86 that we saw last episode, and then a separate opinion on the gas seal, because I feel like it's very important to spell out where these changes occur. So I'm going to beg Mae to use her imagination, because we did not have ammunition on hand and we did not want to go through the time to work up this particular gun when it wasn't really used in the war. But I want to get your sort of imagined opinion on what it's like to handle this guy versus the previous very large 1886. That is a big gun.
One of these things is not quite like the other. Yeah, there is a perceivable difference here, not just in size, but in weight. It feels like, I know it's not practically, or not exactly this amount, but this feels like 2 to 3 pounds heavier than this Norwegian. It's incredible. The Norwegian honestly feels how I wish the 86 did feel. It's very light, it's compact, sights are beautifully tall. Honestly, this has some of the pros that I wish the 86 had to it there. Yeah,
lighter trigger, lighter hammer. You know, people forget, but it's not just that it's lighter overall. You get a lot of that mass off the front of the gun, and it becomes more controllable. You don't have that muzzle all the way down there. You got a fast-shooting smokeless cartridge. Yes, it's smaller than the 9.4, but I'm pretty calm. Like, I feel pretty good about something like that. 6 shots on 1 attacker. Like, that feels pretty good.
And you know, he said the lighter hammer. I didn't even notice it. I think it's because I've been getting used to some hand strengthening training lately, but that is actually a little bit lighter. It is perceivable. That's incredible.
Not only that, but since it's so much closer at hand, you have more control over.
Yeah, I don't have to reach as far forward. I mean, I can actually wrap my finger around the trigger guard on this one.
And you can hook the hammer, and it's so much easier to use.
Oh yeah,
So
I would agree.
I would think between both of us, we would say that the Norwegian or Swedish styles are a clear advantage over the original 86s.
Definitely improvement. Hey, so we're going up in the world,
Right.
I see.
So when we switch over to the Nagant 1895, which is what the Russians adopted, they did a couple of things. They added one more cartridge, so 7 shots. That's
Okay. That's good. Oh, yeah, all right.
okay. They shortened the grip, which is
Okay.
felt like a good grip to me. Now it feels a bit small, but I don't know about you.
I'd agree with you on that one. Honestly, your hand, I'm looking at your hand wrap around. Wrap your hand around that
Yep.
again. You are very crowded on that one. It is,
Yes.
even with just me, if you wouldn't mind,
sure.
it still feels like fairly crowded to me as well. And I fit on it. It's not what I'm used to. I would actually prefer the Norwegian one in this situation. And the 86, definitely I prefer the longer length.
Okay. They shortened up the ejector rod.
I mean, yes, they did. They did. It's not sticking as far out, but then again, I didn't really notice that being a big problem.
I've had no problem with the ejector rod.
No.
And then they added a gas seal system. And as we said, that gets you about 26% more oomph on your cartridge, which is not negligible. That's pretty good, right?
It sounds good. And on paper, that sounds great. What happens when you do that, though? What actually changes when you're handling the revolver when they do that?
Well, why don't you tell us?
Yeah, about that. It's the trigger weight. The trigger is drastically more heavier. It is incredibly heavy compared to before. And unfortunately, I don't think it's worth it. I really don't. Like 26% faster versus insanely heavy trigger pull. Wow.
You get slightly more penetration, which is good,
Okay. That's good.
but at the expense of, I mean, it's got to be a greater than 30% reduction in accuracy in terms of rapid shooting.
Ah.
Why don't you, that gun is, I mean, we unload everything before the show, but why don't you just show them okay, you can do that.
Yep.
And then let's talk, let's show them the lope. Let's get up on that camera and show them what that thing does, single action and double action, tell them where it's at and what is happening as you pull that trigger.
All right, so I'm gonna keep it back here just so it stays in focus. But so we're gonna pull through double action first. All right, already starting to get a little bit of loping in there. Oh, felt that click. Yeah, there's definitely a nice hang up right there. Oh my God, it's perceivably difficult.
Watch her hand flex. Do that again.
Yeah. And I'm trying to pull through slow so that it's not actually, jiggling any. Because if you could see on camera, my hand was shaking and I wasn't snatching the trigger, but I definitely was having to pull it through faster to try to keep my shots as accurate as possible. And then single action, the hammer, you just want to make sure you pull through in like a nice swift action. If you try to pull it through slow, there is a snag in there that you are going to hit that's going to make that incredibly difficult. The single action, it's on the heavier side, don't get me wrong, but it's not too bad, I would
find
say.
a single action pull on the trigger to be very acceptable.
It's definitely, yeah, I would say that is acceptable. It's just that double action, it is just, that is uncalled for. I feel like it is just so difficult to keep your shots in alignment that, and if you look back, I'll show you a picture of my target again, like honestly, you're either going to pull left or right with this one. And granted, the grouping's still not bad, but I definitely was pulling a little bit to the left with this one every time.
And then I want to point out ergonomically, we missed one little key feature. How are those sights doing?
Yeah. So the Norwegian, as I said before, and the previous ones, the 86, the 83, and the 78, they all had fairly tall sights. I would actually argue that they were pretty good point shooters. Like I lined it up and they naturally wanted to point straight at the target, but then just the sights were perfectly lined up every time. They were beautiful, easy to read. This one, unfortunately, the sights are a little bit shorter. I would say they're pretty typical probably of a World War I sight in which they aren't that great.
They are much finer, much narrower peak to that front sight, and they're just hard to pick up. They get lost in the hammer, and it's a little harder to aim.
With double action. Now, the single action, I would say they're pretty middle road. You can read them a little bit better.
If I had 5 minutes to take a shot and I wanted to absolutely bullseye it, I would like these little tiny fine sights because I'd be able to see exactly where I was lined up.
Yes.
But why they put little tiny fine sights, on the gun with probably the worst trigger out of anything we've handled so far in terms of handguns, short of a Reichsrevolver.
Yeah, I'm not trying to pick somebody off with a revolver.
Yeah, so it gets a little weird, and I want to make sure we're not just beating up the Nagant. So let me cover two things. I'm sorry, I'm going to take you over for 1 second. Number one, this is the best Nagant we were able to find in terms of 1895s. This one was made in 1904, is extremely smooth by comparison to others of the refurb process. And then if a lot of you may have handled the refurb ones, those are extremely, you've handled them.
Yes.
We've had one before that I sold on from my own collection. You could barely use it.
This one is the smoothest one I have ever handled. It's beautiful. It really is. It's a great condition revolver that we managed to find.
Yes. So I'm very proud to have this one, and it works very, very well, and I've taken care of it. It looks not the most beautiful on the outside. It runs great. So we're giving it a good shake. I don't want people to feel like we're beating up. The other thing is the ammunition we used was loaded by Fiocchi. It's not as hot as the original ammo. So recoil would have been slightly worse by about probably 30 to 40%. So they are much hotter running guns than you think. You really do get a screaming bullet for your expense for this gas system. The question is that difference worth all the cost in the trigger? I think is the question. And so I want to be fair to Russia on this one because everybody beats up these Nagant revolvers. So let's cover the fairness. They were looking for a single action gun. So the difficulty with the double action pull, they didn't care about because they were adopting a single action gun and then cavalry wind and they just threw in double action. They wanted 7 shots because they did not believe that reloading was that important. They rather have a higher capacity, which does make sense to a degree, but then they just threw out reloading entirely. So it reloads slower than anything we've dealt with practically, short of, again, Reichsrevolver. And then this thing saw rapid manufacturing during wartime and then otherwise sort of downplayed manufacturing. But the specifications that they kept, the tolerances, were exceptional. These are exceptionally good, reliable guns. So I don't want to make them sound like they're crap. They just have an overcomplicated gas seal mechanism that makes double action operation especially painful. That is the sin of this gun. The problem is when you build your entire theory around a single action gun and then throw in a double action option, where does that really net you? And I think that's sort of our final question, which is that would a Nagant revolver in 1895 be something that you would be comfortable with in the Great War?
You know, here's the thing. Othais is right. We unfortunately were bashing it a little bit. So yes, I've got the extra cartridge. That's great. I've got a faster bullet, like it's 26% more fast, or 26% faster. That's also really good. Those two things alone, it's already an improvement, technically, if you think about it. And then you have the problem with the trigger. I understand, yes, if it were just single action only, it would totally make sense. It would be a lot of pros, but then that would be single action only, which in my own personal book, that would default it. It would automatically get a no. Where it's at now, being double action included, and with the tinier sights, I'd still probably give it, a very, very, very fine, like it just almost made a yes. It was right there on the cusp of it. But the problem is that trigger being as heavy as it was is going to make accuracy incredibly difficult for you. Not saying it's not doable, not saying more hand strengthening training, I could get there or anyone could be there, but it's not just about that. The trigger unfortunately isn't quite as smooth as what it could be and what we have felt in the Belgians that it was. And then you got that weight added to it.
From what I hear from quick shooters, the game is not just to be fast on the draw and fast on the shot. You also have to line up the shot. Like, it's this game of risk when you're in a defensive situation of I've got to be able to draw a line, pull, and hit. And the problem is this gun fights you on the draw with its short grip. It fights you on the align with the tiny sights. It fights you on the actual accuracy with the heavy trigger pull. It fights you throughout that entire process. And what it gives you in return is 26% more bullet speed and 1 more bullet. And then you can't get a reload anyway. So you get that 1 extra bullet, but then no swing out cylinder, no nothing else. And
then in our situation, I'm not even doing it to as fast as I possibly could. I'm able to take my time with my shots, and that's still as good as I did. Granted, that was still the same day we fired the Gasser and the Montenegrins and all the other
That's
Nagants.
a big hand workout day for you.
Yes, I got some good hand crampings towards the end of the day, so don't get me wrong, this wasn't fired in the most optimal conditions, but they were certainly better conditions than they were originally fired in.
Now, how many shots were off paper?
No, none of them. None of them were off paper. They were all on target, which was great. I mean, I can't argue with the fact that it was accurate enough that I got them all there, but then the problem lies is that it wasn't exactly where I was aiming.
So, let's do this. May I have that? Take that Norwegian up for a second. Would you take, not that it was in the battle, but would you take a Norwegian like that in the battle?
You know, I would, honestly, simply because I do see it as an improvement over the 86. It's more compact, it's smaller, not quite as heavy, and it's still got all the pros of the 86 with it, I would say.
There's only one negative to this gun. Only one, which is that it's slow reloading. That's it.
Yeah, that's really it. If there was a swing-out cylinder, that would be amazing. These would be phenomenal, all of them.
And if you think of it in that terms, there's only two negatives to this gun that are strong, which is, again, the slow reloading and that terrible trigger control. So, you know, big, meaty, strong man hand power through it. I know some people are going to be very macho about it. Congratulations. Carry this instead of whatever personal defense weapon you want. Go for it. Here's the weird thing, and I want to switch this around for a second. Imagine for a moment that both, because I want to be fair, imagine both these guns are single action only, okay? That's it. There's no double action in existence for you to choose from, okay? Which do you pick? The 7-shot with the faster bullet that has an ever so slightly weirder hammer cock, but basically the same release? Or do you choose the one that's one less round, same general release, but a smoother hammer cock?
I would honestly probably go for the 95 in this situation, simply because I've got an extra round, and weirdly enough, I might like those finer sights also. We didn't talk about that. There'll be this huge sight difference. I might prefer the finer sights with the single shot, or with single action. So, you know what, honestly, the hammer aside, like the hammer I can deal with, but the trigger on that one in single action was pretty comparable, and now I've got an extra shot to boot, and faster bullet.
And therein is why the Russians made this decision. I don't want it to sound like they're insane. They had a reason for doing it. It just turned out to be the wrong military doctrine, and it was held on to for too late. They were making, you know, sort of last generation decisions way into the new generation. So the Nagant is not a bad gun for what it was designed to do, the 1895 that is. It actually does what it's supposed to do almost perfectly. This thing fits the parameters of what Russia wanted to the T. What they wanted just didn't ultimately fit what was on the battlefield.
I would agree.
Yeah. So, with a fair and balanced review of the Nagant 1895 out of the way, I suppose that just wraps us up, unless you have any final thoughts. Like, would you still collect something like this?
Oh, I would absolutely still collect it. I find it a very interesting piece, and the one we have is actually in fantastic condition. It's just unfortunately, for, you know, thinking of the battle situation, just doesn't quite fit. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, I'd proudly own one of these, even in the worst condition with the refurbs and everything, just because the mechanism is so bizarre.
Oh, yeah.
Some of this stuff about collecting, the fun is in what's unusual. And this is such an unusual gun because it was such an unusual decision. All right, well, with that covered, I think we'll just say goodbye, and you guys can check after the credits for any updates.
Have a good one, guys.
This has been an interesting 2 weeks for book titles. Number one, Schiffer Publishing sent over 2 books for me to take a look at. And the outstanding example in this case would be a soon-to-be or possibly just released by the time you're seeing this, Chilean Mauser history book. I know there's a lot of these guns out there, a lot of you own them, and you may want to know a little bit more about it, so definitely give this a quick read. It is great. Now, while we're talking about books, I did a little over a year ago give permission to use some photographs in a history of the submachine gun written by Michael Haidler. This is in the German language. This is another book to check out, and it's got a few of our photos in it. I find him to be an excellent author, and so you guys should go enjoy that. I got an advanced copy the other day. I'm very happy with it. And while we're talking about books still, don't forget Ian McCollum has also released a French rifles history book. So this is a time for you guys to start building your private libraries. Get on over there to Kickstarter and support him. Also, this is a good time to get behind something like that because I understand that this is a very homegrown effort to get another historical firearms publishing company up and running. That would be a good service to our community. So with all that covered, just for our own show, I do have one announcement that I think will interest some of you. Over at Patreon, because Mae has now made it to full-time for C&Rsenal, I have managed to put the hours together to actually sit down and write a sort of light diary every week for the show. I actually update it every other day or so and then publish the draft once a week. Everybody gets to comment and I try to respond to every comment on those. So this would be a good time to maybe become a $1 or $2 patron supporter if you'd like a little sneak peek behind the curtain and a little bit more of a personal connection to what's going on with the show. I'm trying to, as we sort of get overwhelmed with lots of media and emails and things like that, I'm trying to put the emphasis on answering patrons first and foremost. So by all means, hit us up on Patreon if you like what we're doing. All right, have a good one, y'all. Enjoy yourselves.